I can still hear the knock. 3 soft taps, polite, deliberate, almost hesitant. My hand trembled just enough for the sound to betray what my face could not. On the other side of that door, my entire marriage was about to collapse without a sound. The house was smaller than I imagined, white shutters, flower beds just starting to wilt, a car in the driveway that didn't belong to anyone I knew. I remember how the light hit the glass that day. Mid-afternoon. Sharp, exposing. It made the dust on the windshield glow like ash. For a moment, I told myself I was overreacting, that she was probably inside with her cousin, that the whole family trip story was exactly what it sounded like. But my gut had already gone silent, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. When the door opened, I didn't see her first. I saw him, and that was enough. He froze like a man who'd seen a ghost, or worse, the truth. Behind him, in the hallway, hung her coat, the same coat she'd worn when she left that morning. I didn't need to go further. I wasn't supposed to be there that day. That's what makes everything that followed so perfect. I'd told them I'd be out of town for a few weeks, handling a property inspection up north. The kind of dull, bureaucratic excuse no one questions. But when you've spent your life surrounded by people who assume your silence equals simplicity, you learn how to weaponize being underestimated. It's the only advantage they ever gave me willingly. The truth is, I came back early. Not because I missed home. Home had long stopped feeling like that, but because I wanted to confirm a suspicion that had been gnawing at the edges of my sleep. You can tell when something's wrong in your own house. The air changes temperature. Objects shift slightly from where you left them. Doors creak at the wrong times. The home stops breathing with you and starts breathing against you. That's how betrayal sounds, like a house exhaling behind your back. When I parked down the street, I didn't rush to the door. I just sat there in the car, engine off, staring at the second-floor window. Her window. The curtains were drawn, but the shadow movement behind them was unmistakable. Someone was home, and not alone. For a few seconds, I wondered if I should walk away. Pretend I hadn't seen anything. Pretend I was still the man I'd been, obedient, predictable, grateful for small mercies. But that man was buried somewhere between her first lie and my last apology. I stepped out, locked the car, and walked toward the house with the calm of a man about to file paperwork. Not detonate his entire life. We'd lived there for 12 years. The house had seen birthdays, holidays, and more silent dinners than any marriage should survive. On paper, everything looked perfect: dual incomes, modest mortgage, no children, no scandals, stability. But stability can be a coffin when it replaces truth. She'd started calling me distant. I suppose that's easier than calling herself unfaithful. I unlocked the door quietly, more out of curiosity than caution. The air inside felt wrong, warm, perfumed, and staged, like a waiting room for a mistake about to happen. I could hear faint laughter from upstairs. 2 voices, hers and someone else's, low, confident, male. The kind of voice that thinks it's winning. I didn't go upstairs right away. Instead, I walked through each room slowly, my eyes memorizing every detail. The vase on the coffee table moved 2 inches to the left. A wine glass in the sink, 1, not 2. She was getting careless. In betrayal, carelessness is always the first mercy your enemy gives you. When I reached the staircase, I stopped halfway up. The floorboards creaked slightly, just enough to remind me I wasn't a ghost yet. Then I heard it, a laugh. His. It wasn't loud. It was worse than that. It was familiar. I didn't recognize his voice at first, because it had been years since I'd heard it that close. But the tone, the rhythm, it hit like muscle memory, a voice that had once shared my table, a voice that used to call me brother. That's when I knew. She hadn't just betrayed our marriage. She desecrated my history. I didn't burst in. I waited, listened. They were talking about me. He still thinks the company's doing fine, he said, his tone smug. Her voice followed, softer, indulgent. You said the numbers looked good. He won't suspect anything, he chuckled. He never does. That's what makes it easy. It was like listening to your own autopsy in real time. My hand gripped the rail until the wood bit into my palm. I stayed there silent, invisible, memorizing every word. The betrayal was layered. This wasn't just an affair. It was a plan. To understand what that meant, you have to know who I used to be. I wasn't a rich man, but I wasn't poor either. I built a small contracting company from nothing, spent 20 years trading sweat for stability, paid off debts, hired local workers, expanded into renovation projects. My so-called friend Mark joined later when the company was already standing, said he'd help with management, take care of the paperwork while I focused on the field. It seemed like a fair division. I should have noticed the moment I stopped signing the checks myself. But trust blinds sharper than love. I was always the type to keep peace, not scorecards. I didn't snoop through emails or track spending. I believed that loyalty meant freedom, the freedom to not look over your shoulder. But now, standing halfway up those stairs, I realized loyalty only works when both people share the same definition. When their conversation drifted from business to intimacy, I turned and walked back down, silent as the truth they'd buried. I didn't need to see them together. Some sights don't require confirmation. They announce themselves through energy alone. Downstairs, I sat on the couch, still as stone. My heart didn't race. My blood didn't boil. That's the part most people never understand. Real. Betrayal doesn't ignite rage first, it drains it. It's a quiet collapse, the sound of your last illusion hitting the floor. I waited exactly 9 minutes, long enough for them to feel comfortable. Then I stood, straightened my jacket, and left through the back door, closing it softly. Outside, the autumn air felt different, colder, cleaner, the kind of air that clears fog from the mind. I didn't drive home. Instead, I walked past familiar fences, identical lawns, every inch of that quiet neighborhood suddenly foreign. Somewhere between the streetlight and the corner mailbox, something inside me shifted. It wasn't anger. It was precision. Anger is loud, clumsy, wasteful. Precision is quiet, surgical, permanent. That's when I decided I wasn't going to confront them. I wasn't going to shout, accuse, or demand explanations. I was going to dismantle everything they'd built one calm, deliberate move at a time. Back at the motel, I opened my old laptop, the one I used before Mark convinced me to upgrade all our systems to his cloud accounts. It still had everything he thought I'd forgotten to delete: client archives, financial ledgers, supply invoices, project photos, the digital skeleton of the company I'd created long before his name was attached to it. I poured myself a drink. Whiskey, no ice. The kind that burns just enough to remind you you're still alive. Then I started sorting through data names, contracts, payments. Patterns emerged. Numbers didn't lie. He did. Hidden withdrawals, duplicate vendors, fake subcontractors. Every deception hiding behind my trust. They'd used my silence as camouflage. Now, silence was going to become my weapon. The following morning, I drove to the office like any other day. Mark greeted me with his usual grin, pretending nothing was wrong. I matched it, smiled back, asked about his weekend, even thanked him for holding things down while I was away. When people think you're slow to anger, you can hide entire wars behind a handshake. I spent the rest of the day reviewing paperwork in plain sight. I wanted him to see me looking, to feel a flicker of unease without knowing why. Every predator deserves to taste its own paranoia. By evening, I knew exactly what I needed to do. Not loud vengeance, not yet. That kind of noise only alerts the guilty. I was going to erase them quietly first, financially, socially, and legally, before they even realized they'd stepped into my trap. But to do that, I needed proof. Real proof, and that meant another visit. That night, I returned to the house, not as a husband, but as an observer. This time, I didn't park down the street. I parked in the driveway, the same driveway I'd paved myself 15 years ago, with my own 2 hands. The lights were on upstairs again, curtains drawn. Routine breeds complacency. They'd never imagine I'd have the nerve to return so soon. I walked to the side window and saw the reflection of 2 wine glasses clinking. Same man, same woman, same lies, but I wasn't watching them. I was watching the details. The clock on the wall, the timestamp, the sound of his voice carried through the open vent. All evidence I would later use when everything came crashing down. I didn't need confrontation. I needed documentation. When I left that night, I wasn't broken. I was calibrated. The pain had precision now. The betrayal had coordinates. They had no idea that by morning I would already be 10 steps ahead. That every word they spoke in that house would soon become their undoing. That the same trust they exploited would be the rope they'd hang their partnership with. Revenge, I learned, isn't about rage, it's about rhythm. And that night, I finally found mine. If you are watching this and it scratches at something inside you, if it wakes a memory you shoved into a drawer, do me a favor and subscribe to the channel. This story is for the quiet ones, the ones who hold their grief like a ledger until the numbers finally add up. Tell me in the comments if you ever felt betrayed by someone you trusted more than yourself. That engagement helps more than you know. The house felt smaller after that night. Not physically smaller, but reduced, like a discarded photograph cut down to a thumbnail. I moved through rooms that once held meaning the same way a man walks through a town after he has lost the map. The objects stayed the same, but the stories they told had been rewritten by hands that were not mine. At first, the hurt was shock, a flat anesthetic that made everything look like it was happening in slow motion. I replayed the scene in my head again and again, not because repetition would change the facts, but because the mind seeks patterns that soothe. There is a comfort in rehearsal. If you can rehearse pain enough, you tell yourself you understand it, and understanding feels like control. Then came humiliation. That was heavier. Humiliation is an animal you do not expect to carry into adulthood. It sits on your chest like a small corpse and refuses to be buried. It shapes the way you see your own face in the mirror. You begin to hear your silence not as dignity, but as proof that you were invisible when you most needed to be seen. I began remembering small things I should have noticed. The extra receipts in the kitchen drawer marked for supplies that never arrived. The client whose calls went to voicemail more than they should have. Lunches, she said, were with a friend when in truth they were with someone else. Memory is a treacherous thing. It does not reveal its betrayals all at once. It hides them in the edges and waits. My memories did not all come as one coherent film. They came as detail fragments, sensory shards. The smell of the lemon cleaner she favored, the pattern of the coffee mug she left on the counter, the way she would fold the napkin when she was nervous. Those sensory fragments became proof, not of infidelity alone, but of how intimate her lies had become. Someone who touches the small things in your life has a deeper map of you than you realize. She had been mapping me without my consent. I remember a day, 2 years earlier, when we stood barefoot in the yard fixing a fence post. It was a hot June afternoon. We were not speaking about anything that needed to be said. Instead, we stood and worked in a companionable silence, the kind that had once felt like a language between us. She laughed at something trivial, wiped her hands on her jeans, and the laugh landed like a bell. At the time, I thought that laugh meant everything was fine. Now I hear it as a signpost to the moment when our rhythm diverged and I failed to notice. There are people who recover quickly from betrayal and people who are broken by it. I did not break. I calcified. The shock folded into me and hardened into something patient and cold. I found myself cataloging feelings the way I had once cataloged invoices. Label, file, store. It is a useful technique. When the body threatens to lurch, the mind that files keeps you steady. And there were other nights. Nights when I would lie awake rehearsing confrontations. I never gave myself permission to perform. I imagined confronting her in the kitchen light, catching her hand in a lie, making the world tangible with the force of accusation. Those scenarios felt childish. They were theater. I wanted not theater but architecture. I wanted to redesign the foundation so their house could not stand. I also began to revisit Mark, not as a man who was once my friend, but as a strategic variable in a slow equation. I remembered how he had shown up at the company with a crisp shirt and a pitch of loyalty. He was good at the parts of business I did not enjoy. He sat at the desk, smiling while I measured lumber and argued with suppliers. Over time, we slid into efficient roles. He handled spreadsheets. I handled contracting. The roles made us both comfortable. Comfort is the easiest thing for a con to use when the target is numb to warning signs. Grief and anger are messy, and sometimes they collide and form a strange ballast that keeps you from doing anything at all. I had to parse them apart. Grief required a different language than anger. Grief needed ritual. Anger needed architecture. I lit no candles. I wrote no prayers. Instead, I traded ritual for record-keeping. I drove to job sites looking for auditors in the hum of machines and the sound of workers' radios. The droning of power tools had a way of returning me to reality more honestly than conversation. Work became a ritual of maintenance for the mind. I would go to a site, climb scaffolding, and feel the roughness of wood against my palms, and know that external reality would not betray me. Tools and materials were honest. They gave what they promised when you used them properly. People do not always behave that way, which is why we build with boards and bolts and not promises. My closest friends noticed a change. One of them asked if I was all right. I lied and said yes, because on some level I was doing exactly what I had to do. There is a dignity in choosing the lie that preserves your process. Another friend gave me space. Giving space is a rare kindness. It says, I will not crowd your grief, but I will be here when you finish cataloging it. I found myself reflecting on the idea of trust. Trust is a kind of capital, and I had invested mine foolishly. I had been generous because my heart measured success as the extent to which I made life easier for people around me. As a consequence, I had not prepared myself for the eventuality that their ease might be funded by my losses. That realization, slow and awful, was more bitter than any insult. It meant I had been complicit in my own vulnerability. Humiliation brings with it smaller, sharper injuries. When I sat at the office and heard Mark joke about my managerial style in casual tones with a client, the laughter did not pierce me so much as it registered as a failure of surveillance. When certain subcontractors began returning calls about missing payments I had assumed were clerical errors, I felt foolish for trusting the system to protect itself. Pride is not about appearances. It is about not wanting to be seen as the kind of man who missed the cracks. That vanity cuts. I began to examine the timelines of our marriage and our business as if they were an audit file. When did Mark start coming over for dinner? When did she start staying late at friend events? Were the late nights spaced in a pattern that matched certain invoices? You look for correlations when your mind is trying to make sense of deception. It is a cruel math because what you find usually confirms what you fear. The nights were worst. Grief has a long shadow at 2 in the morning. I would stand in the kitchen where the light seemed too harsh, and I would place my palm on the worn counter as if measuring the depth of the betrayal. Sometimes I would hold a photograph of a time that felt uncomplicated. Let the image ask why. The photograph never answered. It only became evidence to be scrutinized. The humiliation also had a performative element. There were moments when I felt exposed to the world, as if my neighbors could see through my closed curtains and read the ledger of my shame. That is a sensation many people do not admit to. Pride often leaves us feeling public, even when our suffering is private. That publicness is poisonous because it forces you to imagine people's judgments when in truth most people are preoccupied with their own small catastrophes. There is a sequence to healing that few people outline. First, you isolate the poison. Then you catalog its effects. Finally, you neutralize it. I was in the cataloging stage, and in doing so, I began to map my revenge. Mapping is not the same as acting. It is the mental scaffold you erect before you build. The mapping required patience. Injury without strategy becomes spectacle. I refused spectacle. I started a list. It was not a list of rage. It was a list of assets, liabilities, relationships, and vulnerabilities. Names went on the list. Companies, friends who knew too much, document trails that could be exploited. The list was clinical. It had columns and subtotals. I kept it on an old legal pad, the type of pad you buy at a hardware store because it reminds you of work that yields results. The legal pad became a talisman. Writing things down transforms rumor into plan. Working through the list, I began to practice control over my own narrative. I rehearsed what I would say in casual conversation so that no one would suspect I was reorganizing their lives. I practiced letting Mark see me as the same quiet man he always underestimated. The trick with a long con is to keep your movements so small the subject thinks nothing is changing. They call it stealth, because the change happens in inches. There were nights when I felt the abyss waiting. The mind offers you primitive solutions, sometimes the quick temper, the dramatic exposure, the blast of noise that promises release. Those were easy, too easy. I had built my life on the slow accumulation of things worth protecting. A quick burn would destroy those things as surely as any betrayal. I was not willing to let relief destroy the future I had put together. So I held. I watched. I catalogued. I let the humiliation ferment into clarity. At the edge of this clarity was a quieter truth. Revenge is not merely about redressing wrongs. In its purest form, it is about reclaiming authorship of your life. When someone steals the narrative, they rob you of the power to continue writing. To me, stepping back into authorship was the imperative. That required removing the hands that had stolen the ink. The emotional fallout did not end with a single purge of feeling. It unfolded like a series of small modifications that, added together, changed the structure of the man I was. Where once I had been naive and conciliatory, I became methodical and reserved. Where once I had assumed the surface of things was honest, I learned to read beneath it. Most importantly, where once I had believed apology would heal, I learned that some injuries only mend with accountability. By the time the catalog was thick and the nights were steadier, the plan had started to take shape. I could see the first moves clearly enough to imagine Mark's confusion when they were executed. I could see her face when she realized the cost of her choices. But those visions came later. For now, I simply sat with the ledger and let the humiliation serve as data. That was my solace. Pain had become a resource, and from resources, you build empires. Small empires at first, the kind that undo other people's illusions and put your life back on its own axis. The audacity of that thought surprised me, and then it steadied me. When morning came, I folded the legal pad, tucked it into a drawer, and left the house as if nothing had changed. The world outside was indifferent, which is its mercy. People walked their dogs, watered plants, complained about small things. To live among those small concerns while carrying what I carried required a strange courage. It required the courage to plan without haste, and to be patient enough to let humiliation be the map, rather than the enemy. There is a moment in every slow-burning thing where endurance stops being a virtue and becomes an excuse. For me, that moment did not arrive with a shout or an explosion. It arrived in silence, in a small, quiet accumulation of facts that finally formed a shape I could no longer ignore. The shape was ugly and honest. I could either remain the man I had been waiting for other people to behave, as if conscience were a contract, or I could become the architect of consequence. The breaking point was not dramatic. It was a calculation. I woke one morning with a sequence of numbers in my head, the totals of missing invoices, the dates Mark had taken long lunches, the times she'd left the house for appointments. It was as if the ledger itself had begun to speak, and I listened until it stopped repeating itself. That morning the ledger said one thing plain and cruel. You have enough. Enough to act. Enough to undo. Enough to write the next chapter on your own terms. Decision changes the body. I felt steadier, like someone who had finally found the right tool for a job he'd been stalling on because he feared breaking the wrong thing. I made a list that day, and this list was different from the last. The last had been an inventory. This one was an operations map. It had dates, dependencies, and contingencies. It named outcomes and the smallest practical steps to achieve them. First, reconnaissance, thorough and legal. I had learned to find proof without theatrics. For that, I would need access documents, witnesses, email trails, a traceable pattern of deception. I knew where to look. I had built the company. There were redundancies, backups, hard copies, a contractor's instinct for record-keeping that Mark had been sloppy enough to assume unnecessary. He was arrogant that way, believing his cleverness exempted him from routine discipline. Arrogance leaves fingerprints. Second, containment. Whatever I did had to be surgical. No collateral damage to the parts of the business that paid the men who fed their families with it. I would not poison the payroll. Revenge that destroys livelihoods is revenge that loses its moral center. I wanted justice, not chaos. That discipline separated me from the thoughtless men who burned bridges to watch them collapse. Third, exposure in sequence. The guilty would be exposed to the people whose opinion they valued: clients, investors, friends before the legal systems got involved. Social consequence bites deeper than the law in small-town networks. Reputation is a currency many of these people valued more than the money itself. I would use that to my advantage. Finally, legal and financial closure. When the social and operational pressures mounted, the law would be there to finalize what I had begun. I did not plan to play vigilante with paper-thin prizes. I intended to let contracts and statutes finish the job so no one could call me a criminal for exercising my rights. With the map in hand, I began to refine the tools. Tool 1. Access. I needed to regain access to the things Mark had locked behind his upgrades. I visited the office in the mornings, long before anyone arrived. I sat at the desk that had once been mine and called clients under the guise of checking invoices. I reintroduced myself to vendors in casual conversation, and in those conversations I found openings accounts that still routed through the old systems, email aliases Mark had forgotten to transfer, a retired contractor who still delivered materials to our address out of habit. Habits are allies when you want to gather evidence. Tool 2. Witnesses. There are always people who notice things and say nothing because they think the inconvenience to their lives outweighs the benefit of telling the truth. I started speaking to them as if I were offering them a favor. It is surprising how willing people are to help when you appear to be doing them a courtesy. A foreman mentioned a deposit that had been rerouted. An assistant remembered an odd check number. Each small admission was a tile in the mosaic I was assembling. Tool 3. Discretion. I used prepaid phones for some calls. I worked from coffee shops and a library where nobody knew me. I sent emails from an old account Mark thought defunct. The point was not secrecy for its own sake, but the tactical advantage of surprise. If they could not see me move, their complacency would remain intact until the consequences arrived. Tool 4. Small, controlled pressure. I was not in a hurry. I chose moments deliberately. A delayed invoice here, a subtle question to a client there. Enough to put a hairline crack in their confidence without giving them cause to suspect anything larger. The first crack is the most revealing. It tells the guilty they are vulnerable. Once they feel vulnerability, panic becomes a poor decision-making companion. There were nights when the strategy felt monstrous, when I wondered if I had become too much like them. That was the moral challenge embedded in revenge. The answer I found was simple. Intention matters. I intended to replace lies with truth, and theft with restitution. I did not want to be petty. I wanted to be precise. That ethical constraint kept the plan from spiraling into cruelty. The practical work began to pay off sooner than I expected. A supplier called to ask why a payment had stopped arriving. I feigned surprise and offered to look into it, all the while documenting the call. A client questioned an invoice Mark had floated. I listened, asked a couple of neutral questions, and offered to clear it up personally. Little fissures became a network of points I could leverage. The pattern was no longer an abstraction. It was a map of wrongdoing in plain sight. Then came the first deliberate strike. Not a headline, just a reallocation. I rerouted a single payment that had been mishandled, sending the correct funds to a subcontractor Mark had defrauded. I did it quietly through channels that required no public announcement. The subcontractor called me later, bewildered and grateful. He had been chased for payment and on the verge of dropping out of a job. I listened to his story and felt a cold satisfaction that the smallest correction could have such immediate real-world effect. It was a reminder that my plan, though engineered for consequence, could also be restorative. The next move was louder, still controlled. I compiled a dossier of the most damning transactions duplicates, shell vendors, invoices with identical handwriting. I made copies. I verified dates. I found the email thread where Mark had suggested a creative bookkeeping solution and the response where she had endorsed it. It felt like holding a scalpel over a wound that had festered. When I presented the dossier to a client liaison, one whose opinion of Mark had weight, the reaction was subtle and devastating. He did not call Mark an idiot in public. He shifted his posture, measured his words, and stopped offering casual trust. Reputation leaks like water through a cracked pipe. You do not see the damage all at once, but if you follow where it goes, the structure weakens. That leak was now in progress. They noticed the pressure, not because I announced it, but because Mark began to make mistakes under it. Small errors crept into his emails. He snapped at the foreman over a minor scheduling issue. He overdrew a petty expense account. Stress reveals who you are. Under pressure, people revert to their base responses. Mark's base was impatience, and impatience becomes obvious when you are used to composure. Meanwhile, my wife, she who had thought herself clever, began to change in different ways. She was more careful when she spoke in front of others, choosing words as if building a sentence were a practice in defense. Once I saw that calculation in her face, I knew the net was tightening. People always carry their guilt in their body language. It's a currency they cannot cash out. At this stage, allies became necessary. I found an attorney who specialized in small business malpractice, quiet, precise, and not prone to spectacle. I explained the situation in clinical terms. He asked for documentation and timelines, which I provided. His advice was practical. Gather proof, preserve communications, and prepare to act in a sequence that maximized leverage before going to court. He also suggested something I had not fully appreciated. Procedural patience often terrifies the guilty more than a reckless public call-out. The slow machinery of legal scrutiny is a pressure that can make crooks crack. With counsel, I formalized the next steps. No rushing, no theatrics. Evidence collection, repairs for those harmed, targeted confrontations with people whose trust Mark relied on. Each move had a purpose. Every public act had a private preparation behind it. There came a moment, about 2 months into the operation, when Mark realized someone was looking. He started asking questions that he could not hide behind his usual charm. He began to check accounts he had ignored. I answered him with the same bland cordiality I had used from day one, letting worry bloom in the spaces he'd used for confidence. The look on his face that day when a supplier called his bluff, half denial, half fear, was as satisfying as any victory I had imagined. But the plan was still fragile. A single misstep could undo months of careful work. I slept less, not because worry kept me awake, but because vigilance had become necessary. The body can adapt to the strain of a long con if the mind believes in the cause. I ate at strange hours and found a rhythm that worked. My days were full of small, deliberate tasks, and at the end of each day, I checked the ledger to see whether the numbers still told the truth I needed them to tell. The breaking point had indeed arrived. It had turned me from a man softened by habit into a man hardened by necessity. I was no longer content to be patient for its own sake. Patience had to be married to execution. The next moves would not be subtle. They would be unavoidable. By the time I closed the dossier and slid it into the locked drawer, I knew the next block of the plan was no longer about reconnaissance or quiet pressure. It was about taking what I had built and dismantling the house around them piece by piece financially, reputationally, legally, so that when the dust settled, there would be only clean foundations left to rebuild upon. I had reached the breaking point. There was no turning back now. Plans are only as good as the patience that carries them out. By the time I reached this stage, patience had become a muscle. I had practiced constraint until it felt natural. Planning justice was not a single moment of brilliance. It was the accumulation of small, irreversible steps. Everything had to be timed, sequenced, and fail-safe. The house had been compromised. Now, the structure of their life would be reappraised with deliberate force. Step 1 was transparency for those who mattered. I could shred Mark's illusions in private, but the true leverage came when other people began to notice the discrepancy between his words and the books. I compiled a short surgical briefing for clients and a separate one for the subcontractors we relied upon. The briefings were factual, unemotional, and written in a language that did not invite debate. Dates, amounts, references. No moralizing, no theatrical flourish. Evidence speaks in a voice that cannot be shouted down. I scheduled face-to-face conversations with 3 clients whose endorsements had once insulated Mark from scrutiny. I did not enter those meetings with accusations. I entered them with questions. People resist when you attack. They listen when you ask to clarify. I asked about deliverables, timelines, and unusual billing entries. I handed over printouts and asked whether the numbers matched their records. Some of them squinted, surprised. Others grew silent. One man, who had once laughed at my cautious accounting, stopped mid-sip of his coffee and said, "Are you sure?" The room shifted. The veneer of trust had been buffed to reveal the cracks beneath. Step 2 was repair for those caught on the wrong end of his greed. This is a tactical move disguised as decency. I arranged direct payments to small vendors we had shorted, routed through an anonymous but above-board channel. It was not charity. It was leverage with a moral edge. When a subcontractor called in thanks and relief, it created a ripple. People remember the act of being rescued, and they remember the person at the center of that rescue. It destabilized Mark's narrative that the company was solvent because of him alone. If anything, it suggested there was someone else who understood the books well enough to correct them. Step 3 required patience and procedural rigor. I worked with the attorney to draft demand letters and to prepare civil claims that would be airtight. The law is obtuse and slow, and that slowness is valuable. It allows facts to settle and pressure to build without drama. We filed notices timed to coincide with the client meetings, so when questions went to the boardroom, legal language was already in the background. You do not need dramatic arrests to ruin reputations. Sometimes you only need a paper trail and a calendar. Step 4 was public pressure, but staged. Reputation is a fragile thing in close networks. I identified key opinion holders, the liaison who recommended contractors, the local inspector with persuasion, a retired bank manager who still advised clients. I gave each of them a tailored packet. The obvious evidence, plus enough context to let them make up their own minds. I never told them what to think. I offered them documentation and a quiet, private option to raise concerns. People who think they are acting independently are the most effective amplifiers. All these moves required strict operational security. I kept backups in multiple forms, hard copies in a fireproof safe, encrypted emails copied to a secure drive, and a private ledger that only I and the attorney knew about. I never trusted Mark's cloud. He had learned to hide behind it. Hiding is effective until someone older and more literal remembers where the paper trail began. There came a week where the plan turned technical. Mark attempted to move funds through an internal vendor he'd created, a shell with a plausible name and a mailbox in another state. He thought he was invisible. He forgot that I had once set up the compliance checks for vendor onboarding. I knew the people who had signed those forms, the phone numbers they listed, and the dates they'd been approved. I had the original scanned paperwork. I submitted a quiet inquiry to the bank and to a client account manager asking for confirmation of routing instructions. The little bureaucratic wheels spun verification requests, hold flags, compliance tickets. It was not a dramatic arrest. It was a bureaucratic chokehold. In 3 days, the account was flagged for suspicious activity, and the transfers were paused. Mark's bedside composure cracked slightly when he realized a movement he had expected would clear had not. The mechanics were indifferent and relentless, the perfect tool for my discipline. Parallel to the financial containment, I began to secure testimony. People respond to moral courage. They respond less to outraged victims and more to those who set a course of calm consequence. I met with the foreman who had almost been driven to insolvency by late payments. I listened. He told me things that were at once petty and illustrative duplicate invoice numbers, subcontractors who had been ghosted. I recorded our conversation with his consent and made a clean transcript. I found a way to gather corroborating statements without escalating fear of retribution. That required time and trust. It required demonstrating that my actions were surgical rather than vindictive. At the same time, I had to manage my public face. A scandal cannot grow if there is no credible narrator who is calm and predictable. I kept my interactions measured. When new questions came up from clients, I offered to investigate, not to accuse. That posture made it harder for Mark to paint me as a vengeful proprietor. It made me look like the steward he had once claimed to be. Perception is a delicate currency. You can earn it with patience. There was a night, late and hollow, where I considered stopping. I thought about the cost. Reputations upended, stability removed, friendships fractured irreversibly. Revenge is not a free resource. It consumes. But I returned to the ledger and examined the arithmetic. The harm had been real and measurable. People had been damaged. There is a practical ethic that sits under the rhetoric of revenge. Accountability is restorative when it corrects theft. That belief steadied me. When the first formal notice landed on Mark's desk, it was not accompanied by fanfare. He opened it and folded it away. Later that evening, he asked me, as if seeking consolation, whether I'd heard about the audit. I kept my face passive. I nodded and asked how he planned to respond. He stammered. That was the sound of confidence losing its guarantee. After the notice went out and the bank held the transfer, gossip began to pulse through the channels. It was the sort of gossip that avoids victims and seeks patterns. People called each other in low voices and shifted in meetings. Mark's emails became defensive and clipped. He scheduled hurried lunches with clients hoping to reassert his narrative. But narrative cultivation is different from documentary proof. When the documents exist, the narrative phrase, I had to be prepared for counterattacks. People who are cornered lash out. Mark employed his charm menacingly, attempting to bully suppliers into silence and to counsel clients that his difficulties were a temporary accounting misstep. He tried to frame the issue as a misunderstanding. That is a common strategy. Normalize the abnormal until it seems ordinary. We countered with documentation and with the silent persistence of routine. Every supplier I paid and every client I met reinforced an alternate story. Here is evidence. Here are corrections. Here is someone acting to repair harm. That posture undermined his narrative. There was also the matter of her. She had been careful, or so she thought. She attempted to negotiate privately with certain clients, offering explanations that wrapped guilt in plausible deniability. We prepared for that by cataloging her communications and by noting the moments where her approval language intersected with suspicious invoices. The record showed complicity, not ignorance. When the local inspector raised a procedural question at a meeting, the room pivoted. Questions that once would have been waved away now required written responses. Small administrative obligations ballooned into formal investigations simply because someone had asked the right question at the right time. A single procedural request took on an outsized effect when it interacted with a prepared dossier. There is a particular cruelty in watching people who thought they were untouchable learn what it means to be touchable. It is never about humiliation for spectacle. It is about the slow retuning of a community's ethical baseline. People who steal trust should expect to be asked to repay it. That is the core principle I acted on. By the time legal proceedings began in earnest, the social scaffolding that had supported Mark's authority was eroded. Clients who once defended him asked for reconciliations. Vendors who were owed money refused to take further work until accounts were squared. The company that once ran smoothly under Mark's facade now hiccuped under operational stress. The law was not swift, but it is thorough. It takes time to translate evidence into consequence, and that translation was my design. Each pause allowed more people to reassess where they had placed their faith. In the end, there is a certain structural beauty to the method. It is not theatrical. It is not chaotic. It is precise. The house they had built professionally and personally unraveled because the foundation had been undermined with patient discipline rather than loud accusation. Justice in that sense became an act of repair. I had not sought to collapse everything indiscriminately. I had sought to unweave the parts that were rotten and to preserve those that were not. When they finally sat across from me in mediated rooms, their composure was gone. Mark tried to charm. She tried to plead. Ignorance. The documents did not care for charm or please. Paper and ledger live longer than alibis. The room closed around them not with violence but with procedure. It was the most effective form of retribution I'd ever found. By the time the judge signed off on the initial restraints and orders, the social ledger had already been recalibrated. Reputation, finances, and trust had shifted in measurable ways. I had not sought to destroy for the sake of spectacle. I had sought to return order to the ledger and to restore what had been taken, insofar as law and consequence allowed. That was justice. That was my plan. The planning stage is always the longest arc of a revenge. It is quiet, disciplined, and deceptively simple. Build proof, apply pressure, protect the innocent, and let institutions do their work. The rest settlement terms, apologies that sounded hollow, the awkwardness of people who had been close were a necessary aftermath. They were consequences worth the cost. When it was over, not everything was repaired, and not everyone returned. That was never the point. The point had been to redraw the map so I could stand on ground I recognized, with my ledger closed and my life back in my hands. Planning justice had been how I reclaimed authorship. It had been how I made silence meaningful again. Momentum is a strange thing. Once justice starts moving, you don't push it, you steer it. By the time the filings settled into the court docket and the audits rippled through the bank accounts, the process no longer needed me to drive it. It had become self-sustaining. I simply watched, like a surveyor measuring how far the collapse would spread. The first domino fell quietly. An email from the bank confirming that several transfers had been frozen pending review. I didn't celebrate. I only noted the timestamp and archived the message. The second arrived 2 days later when a client forwarded me a notice of contract suspension. Mark's name was on every page. No anger, no insults, just sterile language about financial irregularities and temporary hold pending reconciliation. That's how institutions say we've seen enough. After that, gravity did the work. Vendors began calling him instead of me. Some were polite, others less so. Each question he couldn't answer chipped another flake off his credibility. Reputation erodes fast when money stops obeying you. I kept my routine unchanged. Same coffee shop, same morning routes. I answered phone calls with calm precision. When people asked if I'd heard the rumors, I said I'd seen documentation and was cooperating fully. Nothing more. The less you say, the more they fill in, and they always fill in worse than the truth. At home, the silence was different now, no longer haunted, just hollow. She still lived there for a few weeks after the first cracks appeared. We passed like strangers in a museum of our former life. Every conversation was choreography. Her reaching for explanations, me giving none. Guilt makes people talk. Discipline keeps you quiet. I learned that words are often the last refuge of those losing control. One evening she finally said it. I'm sorry. It landed like a receipt printed long after the store had closed. I didn't answer. Forgiveness is a privilege earned through truth, and she had not paid the price. That silence between us was more final than any argument could have been. The business side of the collapse gathered speed. Investigators asked for access to the old archives. I granted it, accompanied by the same lawyer who had guided me from the beginning. Mark arrived an hour late to the first session, flustered, sweating through his collar. He greeted me with a ghost of the grin he used to wear when he thought he owned the room. This time the grin trembled. He tried small talk. I let the silence eat it. There's no pleasure in watching a man implode, but there is satisfaction in symmetry. For every sleepless night he caused, a document now waited with his signature incriminating him. By month's end, the findings became public record. Local papers love modest scandals. They make the powerful look human without bloodshed. The article was brief, factual, and devastating. Local contractor under investigation for financial misconduct. There was no need to name me. Everyone knew. In the following days, his phone went unanswered, his social media vanished, and his once constant invitations dried up. The house, too, began to empty. She packed carefully, as if order could disguise shame. I watched her fill boxes with things I'd built: the table, the chair, the frames that once held us smiling. She paused once, holding a photograph of us from years ago. For a moment, her face softened into something almost human again. I felt nothing. Compassion without trust is pity, and pity has no place in closure. When she left, she didn't look back. I didn't either. There's an odd quiet after victory. People expect triumph to be loud, but true justice hums. It's the sound of weight redistributing itself correctly. Still, I learned that closure is maintenance, not euphoria. The world doesn't give you medals for surviving. It simply gives you back the mornings you used to dread. Those mornings became ritual. I walked the property lines, pruning what had overgrown during the months of deception. Manual labor is a good antidote to moral fatigue. The body understands truth before the mind admits it. With every branch I cut, I could feel space returning literal and metaphorical. The house breathed again. One afternoon I received a letter from the attorney. Settlement terms. Mark's assets were being liquidated to cover restitution. My portion, though significant, was secondary. The real victory was in the clause that barred him from holding fiduciary roles for a decade. 10 years of enforced humility. I read the document once, initialed where instructed, and mailed it back without ceremony. As for her, she attempted a quieter form of redemption. A message appeared weeks later, apology mixed with nostalgia, the usual blend. She wanted to meet, to explain. I declined. Understanding her reasons would not rewrite her choices. I had spent enough of my life translating other people's excuses into my own losses. People often ask, what did it feel like, watching them lose everything? The honest answer, it felt balanced. Not joyous, not cruel, balanced. Like leveling a table that had wobbled for too long. There's relief in symmetry. Eventually, even gossip grows tired. The town found new distractions. My name faded from their whispers, which is all I ever wanted. Peace is anonymity restored. Months passed. The company, stripped of its parasites, began again under a new name. Smaller, cleaner, honest. I rehired a few of the workers who had suffered during the chaos. I paid them on time, listened more, spoke less. They noticed the change, though none mentioned it outright. Trust, once broken, returns only through consistency. Each payday was a brick in that slow rebuild. Sometimes I drove by the places that had featured in my downfall, the restaurant where they used to meet, the office where he forged signatures, the courthouse where truth finally spoke. I didn't linger. You visit ruins only to remind yourself what not to rebuild. If revenge had a final act, it was quieter than anyone would imagine. It wasn't the verdict or the articles or the frozen accounts. It was the morning I looked at my reflection and saw neither victim nor avenger, just a man back in command of his own silence. That was all I ever wanted. Justice, I learned, is not a single event, but a maintenance schedule. You keep it running by staying honest in small ways. You treat every promise as if it has a receipt attached. And when people ask how I managed to stay so calm through it all, I tell them the truth. Calm isn't natural. It's earned one decision at a time, even now. When the night is still and the clock ticks against the wall, I sometimes think about that first evening, me in the car, staring at the lit window, knowing but not yet acting. I understand that version of myself better now. He wasn't weak. He was collecting data. He was waiting until emotion could be replaced with precision. If I could speak to him, I'd tell him this. You were right to wait. You were right to listen. Because patience, when combined with truth, is the sharpest weapon in the world. So the story ends not with an explosion, but with restoration. The ledgers are balanced. The noise has stopped. The silence is mine again, and this time it's earned.